Hello and welcome. What has happened to America's mission to oust the Taliban and crush al-Qaeda for the attacks of 9/11? It was on this day 8 years ago that the US led the massive attack on Afghanistan in response to what happened on American soil less than a month earlier. Well, today that war rages on with no end in sight. Almost 70,000 foreign troops are engaged in daily battles with the Taliban, who warn that they are, quote, prepared for a long fight. Meanwhile, in many Western capitals, especially Washington, D.C., war fatigue is setting in. The Obama administration insists that withdrawal is not an option, but has not announced whether or not it will boost the number of American soldiers in Afghanistan, as U.S. field commanders have reportedly requested. So today we ask, what is America's strategy for Afghanistan, and is it sustainable? You can take part with your questions. One of the ways is by logging on to livestation.com, and of course we'll welcome your phone calls onto the show as well. Well, I'm joined by Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt, who recently retired from a 30-year career with the US Army that included top posts in Iraq and the Gulf. He also served as Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs, which is the liaison between the US Departments of State and Defense. And we have Tamim Ansari, an Afghan-American writer who lives in San Francisco, California. For the past 8 years, he's been advocating going after al-Qaeda and the Taliban without jeopardizing relations with the Muslim world. Mr. Ansari is author of Destiny Disrupted, A History of the World Through Islamic Eyes. Gentlemen, I welcome you to the show. In general, if I could start with you, sir. The review of U.S. strategy in Afghanistan by General Stanley McChrystal has pretty much fueled the debate about the need for more troops there. But is it wise, in your opinion, for America to get that much more deeply involved? I mean, considering how bad the situation has been and the lack of progress for the past 8 years.
Well, I think the first point is we've got to recognize that we're already there, and we've got to finish the job that we started. So certainly it's appropriate to do a strategic review. Certainly it's appropriate for us to say what are the proper amount of resources, whether in troops, civilians, assistance, that is going to be necessary. So, yeah.
In your opinion, is there actually a viable military solution for Afghanistan?
There's not a viable military solution alone. It's going to take more than just the military solution. It will take diplomatic efforts. It will take work with governance. It'll take some measure of anti-corruption to handle a number of the problems that plague Afghanistan. It can't be solved by the military alone.
Well, let's get Tamim Ansari in here as well. And I guess, Tamim, I should ask you, at what point should America say enough is enough and start scaling back on the military presence?
You know, I don't want to talk about scaling the military presence up or scaling it down. I think it's important to talk about what the military is doing in Afghanistan. I think if you talk about scaling it down and moving towards removing U.S. troops from Afghanistan, you're inviting chaos and bloodshed that's going to follow that. But what strikes me is that what the military is doing is aggressively being in Afghanistan and hunting down somebody. And that somebody is indistinguishable from the civilians that we're allegedly there to protect. So that seems like a difficult strategy. I think what we need to do is think about finding a place where we can launch some kind of a productive effort, something that perhaps the insurgents might want to attack. Let them come to us rather than us going to them.
So I mean, we had a question from a viewer in Egypt through Facebook, through our Facebook page. Mohammed Al-Safani wrote in saying, U.S. policymakers are beginning to acknowledge that the Afghanistan mission is irrelevant to combating terrorism. What I'm most curious about is how come policymakers are not aware that they are taking the identical path of the former Soviet Union? Now, of course, the powerful Russian army, among others, failed to control Afghanistan. What is there to suggest that perhaps America could have a different outcome?
Well, it's true that America now finds itself roughly in the same position as the Soviet Union, in the sense that it's operating from increasingly garrison-like cities against the countryside that's increasingly full of guerrillas. It seems to me that still the question in Afghanistan is how to how to stabilize the country, how to make it governable. And it seems to me that in the past the problem was not that terrorists had some hideouts in the crags of the mountains between Afghanistan and Pakistan, but that they had an entire country. And I feel that, you know, what we can still do, what's still possible, is to make Afghanistan viable so that they don't have a whole country. And if we do that, and if there's a viable, credible government in Afghanistan, that government will be able to, keep it from being a base for terrorist operations.
Okay, we've got a caller from Somalia. Good to hear from there. Ahmed's on the phone. What would you like to ask, Ahmed?
Yeah, I'm just wondering how important is the fight on corruption in Afghan government, and to actually to use the money where the whole international community is putting on the country, to use the money well and not goes to different warlords and corrupt politicians.
General, I think you touched on this. What's in your opinion?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very good question. It's a very good point he made. Corruption goes to the fundamental roots of society. I mean, if we are trying to help build a governing society, a governance system inside of Afghanistan, there has to be actions taken towards rooting out the corruption inside many parts of Afghan society. The people want to look to the central government. They want to answer to the central government. They want to see a central government responsive to them. But if they see it not as a benevolent government, but as a corrupt government, it really eats away at everything we're trying to do there.
Well, has the U.S. and its allies sent the money the right way?
In many ways, much of it's not an issue of the money, it's an issue of how the money is being used and where the corruption is being worked. I mean, I think it would be very, very impractical to try to set up a separate system by which money is somehow cleansed and watched every step along the way. This is not simply just an American assistance. It's in all forms of assistance that's given other governments and commercial transactions as well.
General, I'm going to put a question to you that came in from a viewer from Ghana who wrote in to us, from Kwame Nyanin, who wrote in saying, how can there be an end to the war when the resources of that war are increased? I think America should withdraw its troops rather than increase the number by 40,000. Of course, we've touched a bit on this scaling up or scaling down, but to what extent do you see this debate over the troop numbers starting to hurt the Obama administration and its mission to try to find some resolution?
Well, frankly, I think what is harming the debate is the fact that the debate is being conducted in the public forum. One of the problems with General McChrystal's assessment being leaked to the press is what we're now seeing is this being argued by everyone to include what we're doing here today. The number of troops is really not the core issue here. That is only one element of a long-term strategic review and a thorough strategic review that will be done. Unfortunately, it's become the single point of friction in this entire debate, and it really distracts from the strategy that's trying to be developed.
Well, Tamim Ansari, the issue with the greater military presence, of course, is the increased chance of collateral damage, something you mentioned about the being able to or failing to distinguish between the civilians and the target enemy. Now, considering what we're witnessing in Afghanistan, how long do you think the people of Afghanistan will be willing to put up with the high civilian death toll that we're seeing?
Well, first of all, I don't think increased number of troops is necessarily exactly synonymous with more civilian deaths, because the other thing that they're talking about is fewer troops but operate through drones and other kinds of mechanized warfare. And I think that also produces unintended civilian casualties. That's actually been one of the bigger problems. I think that the fact that the insurgency is spreading and is now, at least to some extent, it exists in 90% of the provinces of Afghanistan, means that the Afghan people are more or less not putting up with it already.
Well, let me ask you this one, Tamim. This came in from Georgia in the USA through our Facebook page. And Will Mosley wrote in saying, just because al-Qaeda and Taliban training camps are destroyed doesn't mean the training is gone from their minds. I believe that the US and NATO may pull out their troops, but this war is far from being over. I mean, it's a valid point that there's still the mindset issue in Afghanistan that has to be dealt with.
The mindset issue in Afghanistan and also in other countries, it's not only there. I agree with this guy. I think that the problem is not an organization that has to be eliminated, but a mindset, sort of an ideology, a philosophy that exists in the world and that can now be mapped onto local conditions where there's some grievance people have that doesn't have to do with, say, Islam versus the West or some grand ideological thing. It's local, but it can be, meaning can be mapped onto it, and activity can be spurred on by using this ideology. So I think there's a lot to what this guy says.
Well, General, in our live station chat room on the internet, Brady in Connecticut has written in saying, the Taliban eradicated the opium growers before the US invasion. So why is cheap Afghani heroin flooding into the United States?
Well, it is more a complicated question than just the Taliban eradicated it and it is now being allowed to grow. The fact is, the way the Taliban eradicated it was, in many ways, they eradicated many of the farmers that were doing it, cutting off their hands, taking away parts of their families, so on and so forth. It is very easy to establish a terrorist state that not only gets rid of heroin and gets rid of poppy, but also takes away civil liberties, denies human rights, prevents women from going to school. So yes, there is a solution to the poppy problem by the heinous actions of the Taliban. I don't think that's something the Afghanistan people want, and it is certainly not what the rest of the world
wants.
It's
not sustainable, essentially, as well.
Yeah, well, right.
Tamim Ansari, this question came in from a viewer in Australia through our Facebook page. Asif Nasir wrote in saying, the US and NATO army is thinking that this is another country like Vietnam or Korea, but they don't know that when the Pathans go mad, nothing stays in front of them. A Khan will die with honor, but will never accept a life of slavery. I know you're wary of the categorization of Afghans, into different groups. Is it essentially, I mean, is there a need to see them more as a homogenous group?
Well, Afghans are not a homogenous group, but I think that Afghanistan differs from Vietnam in one really important way, which is that in Vietnam there actually was an entity with a program and a policy, and if the other side won, then there was a government they would put in place. I don't think that's really the case in Afghanistan. I think, we know that there's our side, but on the other side, it's a scatter of lots of forces with lots of agendas and lots of impulses, so that if our effort collapses and we move out, what will come into being first is not some different form of government, but a period of chaos, such as happened after the first time we pulled out in 1992. Between then and 1996, there was a horrific civil war, and then something else will come out of that rubble.
Well, I'm going to take a very short break here. I know we've got people standing by on the phone, so I'm going to ask you both to stand by as well. We're back with more of our discussion on the Afghan war in just a moment. Stay with us.